Okay, well, hopefully everyone can see me. This is the first time that we've done this in this setting, so hopefully this works, and hopefully you can all hear, see me, and are able to participate today. So first of all, thank you very much for joining today. My name is Lior Samfiru. I'm the employment lawyer, and I am here, as you know, to talk about something very important, something that I know a lot of you have been struggling with, dealing with, have questions about, and that is mandatory vaccines, and in particular, how that applies in the workplace. So this is obviously a very important topic, and we're going to cover it today. Now, just so you know, this session is being recorded, and it's recorded so that later on, if you want to refer back to it, you can do that, or if you want to refer others to it, you can do that as well. We're going to post it this week on our website, which is covidrights.ca. So you'll be able to see it there and refer others to it. Now, I know a lot of you have questions, and I've been getting questions. I've been answering questions nonstop for the past number of weeks. But because I know your questions, because I know the issues that you want to know about, I'm going to be answering them. I know exactly what I need to talk about here, and I promise you that if you listen to me, the questions that you have will be answered today. So I know what you're struggling with. I know what you want to know, and I will talk about all of that. So for now, hold off on typing in questions, because I will absolutely be able to answer those questions for you as we go. And obviously, at the end of the session, if you have questions, I'll try to take more questions. But I'm pretty confident in saying I'll be able to answer a lot of your questions just in my little presentation here. So this session really is about mandatory vaccines, whether what an employer is doing right now in imposing vaccines, whether that's legal, what you can do about it, can you lose your job? Do you have to reveal what your vaccine status is? Do you have to do a PCR test? What to do if you are being given an ultimatum? All those things, I know exactly what you've been struggling with, so I will answer that. Now, I want to make it very clear that, first of all, the reason we're doing it in this setting is we've been so busy. We've been having literally thousands of people contacting us. So we thought that to make this efficient, rather than go individual by individual, because the questions are so common and widespread, we'll do this session, and hopefully we'll give you the information that you need. Of course, if we don't and you still want to talk to me privately, my team privately, you can do that. You can always go to the website that I already gave you, covidrights.ca, or our main firm website, which is employmentlawyer.ca. So again, for those joining us, my name is Lior Samfiru. I'm a partner and the head of the employment law practice at Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. We operate in Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And what I'm going to be talking about today is going to apply to those provinces. Now, a lot of what I say is going to be relevant in other provinces as well. But because of the fact that I only practice there, I'm only going to vouch for this information for Ontario, BC, and Alberta. Now, I want to make it very clear that this session is not about whether the vaccines are good or bad. It's not about whether we support liberals or support conservatives. It's not about any of that. It's about the law. The law is the law, and the law is neutral. And what I'm going to tell you is going to be the same whether the vaccine is amazing or the vaccine is not good. The law is going to be the same, all right? This is not about my views about the vaccine or anyone's views. It's about what the law says your rights are and what the employer's rights are. That is what this session is about. So I'm not making any statements about the vaccine. I am sticking to the facts, to the law. That's the nice thing. The law doesn't have an opinion. The law is simply the law. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, what is happening out there in the workplace? As you guys know, I'm seeing employers across the province, across all provinces and across all industries, imposing mandatory vaccines, putting ultimatums and drawing lines in the sand saying, well, if you don't get vaccinated by a certain date, we'll put you on a leave of absence, or we'll let you go. Or if you don't agree to do COVID tests, then again, we'll put you on a leave of absence and let you go. And we're seeing also some governments implementing mandatory vaccine policies and mandates. So that's really what the focus is and the legality of these scenarios. Now, let's then talk a bit about that. Let's talk a bit, first of all, about unionized employees, all right? Unionized employees are in a much more difficult situation when it comes to these issues than non-union employees. And the reason for that is that the only one that can help or represent a unionized employee is the union. And because of that, if you're a unionized employee and your union supports you, no problem. The union can file a grievance, deal with the employer, take the required legal action, and deal with it. If the union doesn't support you, if the union says, well, 80% of our members support the vaccine, so we don't want to support the 20% that don't, unfortunately, as a unionized employee, you don't have many options. You can't come to me and say, I'm going to hire Lior and have him represent me. You can go to another lawyer. You can't sue your employer. You can't even sue your union. You're in a way, and I hate saying this, in a way stuck, because a unionized employee doesn't necessarily have the rights. The union has the rights, which means the union has to pursue it. The only thing that a unionized employee can do if the union doesn't support them is potentially file a complaint against the union with the labor board. It's called a duty of fair representation complaint. So that is an option. But in terms of saying, well, the union's not supporting me, so I'll deal with this on my own, you can't. So I've been getting hundreds and hundreds of emails over the past couple of weeks from people saying, hey, I'm part of a union, what do I do? And the answer almost always is, you have to talk to your union and get the union to support you. And if they don't, if they say, we support what the employer is doing, we're not doing anything about it, you're kind of stuck. And if you lose your job, and if the union won't fight for that job, I don't know, terrible scenario. I'm not saying it's right, but that's how our laws work. And that's probably one of the biggest problems with being unionized, is the fact that you can't deal with your employment issue. It has to be the union that does it. So what I'm going to be talking about today really applies to non-union employees, because as I said, unionized employees have their options very, very limited. It has to be the union. Whereas non-unionized employees have a lot of options and entitlements, and there's things that you can do. And I'm already representing many non-unionized employees that are dealing with this issue, with the mandatory vaccine issue. So keep that in mind. I wish I had better news. I wish I could do something for unionized employees, but again, that's simply how our law works. Now, so let's kind of analyze the situation. Let me tell you what this means in your rights. So the first thing we always have to ask ourselves, is there a government mandate that requires my employer to do something? If there's a government mandate that says, employer, in order to have an employee, you must have them vaccinated. You don't have a say, employer, you have to do that. If there is a government mandate that in a way your employer's hands are tied, so whether they agree with it or not, they don't have the option not to comply with it. They must do what the mandate says. And if as a result of that, you lose your job, there's not going to be much that you can do about it because your employer's hands are tied. It comes back to the government. Now, you may have challenges against the government based on charter violations, perhaps. The problem with that is those charter violations, any of these actions against the government take years. If I say 5 years, I'm not exaggerating, and that's not going to help you save your job. So practically speaking, if it's the government that's mandating, you don't have that many options. Whereas obviously if it's the employer, it's different. Now, I guess the good news is so far, there's been very, very few mandates. In fact, let's start with Ontario. In Ontario, there really isn't a vaccine mandate. The government has not implemented a vaccine mandate. The closest the Ontario government has come is to say that for those employees in healthcare, hospital, long-term care, et cetera, you have to have either a vaccine or you have to agree to a regular COVID test. So as long as you agree to a regular COVID test, there's no requirement by the government that you be vaccinated. So in Ontario right now, there is no industry where the government said you have to be vaccinated or else. So that's not the case in Ontario. Now in Alberta, again, no mandates. In BC, the BC government has implemented mandatory vaccines for those working in long-term care homes. So if you work in a long-term care home and your employer says, well, hey, government says I have to, it's not up to me, they're right in a way, because again, it's not up to them and they have to do this because they can't operate otherwise. But for most people, the vast majority of you, almost all of you, there is no government mandate that requires your employer to vaccinate or to have you vaccinated. So that's very important to remember. Your rights would be very different if there was a government mandate. So if there's no mandate, but your employer still says, we don't care about the mandate, we're deciding that we have to have you vaccinated, and if you don't agree to be vaccinated by whatever date, then we'll suspend you or we'll fire you. So the question is, can they do that? That's the main question, right? Can my employer mandate a vaccine? So I'm going to give you the legal answer first, and the legal answer is arguably no. Arguably, a vaccination requirement like that is a human rights violation. It's a human rights violation for a number of reasons, and one of them, not one that many people are talking about, is on the basis of what we call perceived disability. To the extent that your employer doesn't want you to come into work because they think you may have COVID or be more susceptible to COVID, because COVID is a serious illness and could be considered a disability, that is actually discrimination on the basis of perceived disability. That's regardless of whether you have a religious exemption or a medical exemption. Of course, it could be another form of discrimination if you do have an exemption and your employer ignores that. I'll talk more about exemptions in a second. So bottom line, if you're asking me, can my employer mandate that I get a vaccine? Can they say, if you don't, you're out of here? Arguably, that's illegal. They cannot do that. So what does that mean? Well, here's where we talked about it from a legal standpoint. Here's where the practical standpoint comes in. And that is, despite the fact that it may be illegal, there's actually no way to stop it. In a sense, what I mean by that is if your employer says, hey, thank you for telling me what the law is, but I'm going to do it anyway. I am going to let you go if you don't get vaccinated. You can't physically stop your employer from doing that, from letting you go. What you can do, though, if that happens, if your employer suspends you or lets you go, is you can pursue human rights damages, and you can certainly pursue severance. I'll talk to you about severance much more in just a second. So you can pursue damages. The way our legal system works is that you can't stop someone from doing something illegal. All you can do is get damages if someone does something illegal. All right? The way example I've been given recently is, listen, it's illegal to run a red light. But if I'm going to walk out and run a red light, you can't stop me. You can't physically stop me from doing that. But if I do, there's going to be consequences. I may have to pay a fine. I may lose my license. There's consequences. The same thing happens if your employer lets you go. If your employer says, if you don't get vaccinated, I'm letting you go. There's consequences, but you can't stop that. So ultimately, the first question you have to ask yourself, and I know I'm putting it somewhat bluntly, is, am I actually willing to lose my job? What's better for me? Is it better for me to get the vaccine and keep my job, or not to get the vaccine, lose my job, and pursue damages? Because as I said, the fact that it may be illegal, and we'll talk about illegality more in a second, does not mean you can stop it. Now, there's a few things that you can do, and I'm going to talk about those in a moment, that to increase the likelihood that your employer is going to back off, okay? But ultimately, your employer will decide if they let you go. Your employer is going to make that determination. So a lot of employers are saying, and I've seen this and it makes me shake my head, that if you don't get vaccinated, we're going to let you go for cause. In other words, we're not going to pay you any severance. Nonsense, okay? That would be a wrongful dismissal. Even though your employer can let you go, as I said, physically you can't stop that, even if it's illegal, they always are going to have to pay severance. Why? Because refusing to vaccinate it is not a form of misconduct. You're not doing something wrong. Your employer doesn't have the ability to impose that, and if they do and you don't do it, that's not a form of misconduct. So even though many employers think, well, I can just let you go for cause and not pay you anything, no, they are going to legally have to pay you severance. That severance could be as much as 24 months. I'll talk about how we calculate severance. So apart from any human rights damages, severance is going to have to pay, and it's not a week per year of service or 2 weeks per year of service. It can be a lot more than that. Now, what happens if your employer is saying, no, I'm not going to let you go. I'm just going to put you on an unpaid leave of absence, or I'm going to suspend you without pay. Can they do that? No, they can't. Why? Because an unpaid leave of absence or a suspension in the eyes of the law is the same as a termination. okay? An unpaid leave of absence is a termination. We call that a constructive dismissal. So if your employer says, no, we're not firing you, Joe, we're just going to put you, Joe, on an unpaid leave of absence for a while. You have the right to treat that leave of absence as a termination and require your employer to pay you severance. And again, that severance could be as much as 24 months. So the employer is not able to get around the requirement to pay severance by saying, well, I'm not terminating, I'm just putting on a leave of absence. It doesn't work that way. Now, if you are in a leave of absence, you can choose to stay on it. You don't have to consider that to be a termination. That is your decision, of course, but you have the right and the ability to say, that is a constructive dismissal. I am not accepting that. So that is something that you have a right. Keep in mind, kind of rehashing before I continue, not legal necessarily, not legal to mandate a vaccine, okay? Not legal unless there's a government mandate, not legal for the employer, but despite that, the practical reality is that you can't stop your employer from doing that. It's just a matter of severance. It's just a matter of the amount of compensation that you're going to be owed if that happens, okay? Very, very important to keep those distinctions in mind. The legal answer, not legal. The practical answer, can't stop it, but damages are owed. Now, a lot of employees are saying, but that's fine, Lior, I understand that. I'm owed severance, you can help me get that severance, but I don't want to lose my job. That's my main focus. I want to keep my job. How do I keep my job? So let me give you some ideas. Ultimately, keep in mind that is up to your employer. Your employer is going to decide if you lose your job or keep your job. But here's some ideas, some ways to try to maximize the likelihood of keeping your job. First of all, I want your employer to understand that you do take this seriously, this pandemic, the situation we're in, and that you're going to be diligent with masking. You're going to be diligent with social distancing, physical distancing, that you're not just going to pretend as if there's no COVID. So you're going to take that seriously, that you're going to tell your employer if you have symptoms, excuse me, that you're willing to do a screening tool. In other words, to say if you have any symptoms or if you've been in contact with someone that has symptoms, so you're willing to do that, okay? The fact that you're saying I'm not going the vaccine route doesn't mean that I'm not taking it seriously. So that's number one. Employers need to know that we don't have this employee that's going to go and just make a point to get everyone sick. That's going to help right there. Now, beyond that, I want to make sure that you also suggest to your employer, if that's possible, hey, let me work from home. A lot of us have been working from home since COVID started a year and a half ago. And a lot of times the employer may say, well, fine, if you can work, if you're okay working from home, then this becomes a moot point. So suggesting that, again, the worst thing your employer can say is no, but suggesting that certainly is helpful. And if later on there is a case against the employer, by suggesting that, that actually is good. You actually make your case better. If you have a medical condition, okay, and because of that you can't get a vaccine, get a doctor's note. Now that doctor's note doesn't have to say what the medical condition is. That is private information. Doesn't matter if it's because you have a thyroid issue or because you're suffering from some other condition. It doesn't matter. But if your doctor gives you a note that says, for medical reasons, this person cannot get vaccinated, if your employer disregards that, that's another form of human rights violation. That just makes the situation that much worse. And a lot of employers are going to say, okay, fine, fair enough. If you can't get the vaccine, we'll accommodate. We'll find a solution. Okay, so get that doctor's note. That to me is probably one of the most powerful things you can have is that doctor's note. Of course, I'm not a doctor, so it's not up to me whether you can get that note, but speak to your doctor, all right? And see what the doctor says. And in many situations, maybe the doctor agrees that for medical reasons, you can't and should not get the vaccine. Now, if you feel that for religious reasons, you cannot get the vaccine, one of the things you may want to do is speak to a religious leader in your community, a minister, a rabbi, a priest, whoever the right person is in your religion, in your community, and get something from them if they're willing to give you a note, something that says, you know, this is a legitimate belief in our religion, in our religious community, so that your employer knows that this is not just something you're saying because you don't want to get the vaccine. Okay, so that is very helpful to get something from a religious leader. The key with the religious exemption is for the employer to know that this is an honestly held belief. Do you truly, honestly believe that this is something that is legitimate, that you want to, that it is a religious belief, and it's not just something you're saying to try to get a pass on the vaccine? And again, if you provide that information, if you have that note from a religious leader, and if the employer says, yeah, no, I don't care about that, again, that could be another form of a human rights violation. Later on, if we need to deal with that, there's additional helpful issues there that could help the case. So a religious exemption, that's how you deal with it. Beyond that, think about COVID testing, suggesting to your employer, well, how about instead of a vaccine, I agree to regular COVID tests. So that way, I don't have COVID and everything is fine. Now, I'll talk more about COVID tests for those that don't want to do it, but that is an option if you're okay with that, to suggest COVID tests to your employer. So we talked about ensuring that your employer takes it seriously. We talked about working from home. We talked about doctor's note, religious exemptions, COVID tests. So those are all ways where you can potentially convince your employer not to let you go or to give you an exemption to allow you to continue working. Ultimately, though, if you do those things and your employer still says, fine, but I'm not doing it, if no vaccine, then no work, you will lose your job if you don't get vaccinated. I want to be clear. But, and this is important, there's going to be legal recourse. I've already been retained by quite a number of people that have already lost their job because they said no to the vaccine, and we're dealing with that. So you have that option. I'm happy to talk to you if you lose your job, if you're suspended, if you're put on an unpaid leave of absence, because you do have rights. It's not about what I think about your decisions, just like it's not about what you think about my decisions. It's simply about what the law says. And if the law says you should get compensated, if this is not legal, then you know what? Then you should have those rights and you should pursue those rights. So that's a few ways where you can keep your job, hopefully. Now let's talk a bit more about COVID testing. So some employers have said, by the way, so those that have joined us, I see the note there. We are recording this seminar. It's going to be posted on covidrights.ca. Those that joined us, my name is Lior Samfiru, talking about mandatory vaccines. You can always connect with me, by the way, through covidrights.ca or through employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca to connect with me off this session, offline. Happy to chat. You'll see my phone number, my email address, fax number if that's your thing. So you'll have it all there. Now, wanted to talk about COVID testing. Some employers have said, okay, if you don't want to get the vaccine, well, you're going to have to undergo regular COVID tests. And in fact, if you're working in healthcare in Ontario, for example, then your employer is mandated at a minimum to have you have regular COVID tests. Now, some of you have been telling me, I don't want to do regular COVID tests. So what do I have to? So here's the thing. Requiring a COVID test may not be illegal. It may not be a human rights violation. Unlike what I said before, that requiring the vaccine may well be a human rights violation. Requiring, for most people, requiring COVID tests is not illegal. That said, and this is important, if you refuse and are let go, you are still owed severance. It's still going to be a wrongful dismissal if you're let go without severance. So not illegal, but it does not give the company the right to let you go without severance. Now, of course, if you are working, for example, in the healthcare industry in Ontario, and you refuse to have COVID tests, at that point, your employer is able to let you go without compensation, without severance, because there's the government mandate. All right, there's a government mandate at that point, and your employer doesn't have a choice. But for those that are not in healthcare, if you refuse a COVID test, well, and you lose your job or are suspended or unpaid leave of absence because of it, that also is something that entitles you to severance. So very important to remember that. The next topic on my list here is, wait a second, take a step back. do I even have to tell my employer if I have had the vaccine, if I'm getting it, or if I've received it? Do I have to disclose that information? So let's start with Ontario. In Ontario, we have legislation called the Occupational Health and Safety Act. In the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's a section that says it's illegal to demand an employee's medical information, and you can't punish an employee for refusing to provide that information. So arguably in Ontario, it's actually illegal to require you to provide your proof of vaccination unless there's a government order that says otherwise. Employers don't understand that. They're actually breaching the Occupational Health and Safety Act. That said, let's go back to what I said before. Despite that, if an employer does it, I don't care about this Occupational Health and Safety Act. If you don't tell me your status, you're out of here. As I said, you will lose your job. Now that's illegal. And because of that, there's going to be damages potentially that the employer has to pay. But again, you can't actually physically restrain and prevent your employer from letting you go. Okay, so not legal, okay, not legal, but you can't prevent it. So it's okay to tell your employer, I understand there's section 63 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act that says you can't demand if I get vaccinated, so I'm going to decline. Now, what your employer does with that is up to your employer. As far as I'm aware, in BC and Alberta, we don't have the same sections, the same legislation. So it's not illegal per se to demand to know what your vaccine status is, okay? Your employer can't publish that, can share that with others, because that would be a breach of privacy rights, but there's nothing specific in Ontario and in BC and in Alberta, I should say, that prevents your employer from asking and even demanding to know if you've had the vaccine. In Ontario, not legal, but again, some employers are disregarding that, so it becomes a question of damages. Now, let me talk a bit about federally regulated employees, because our Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, has made an announcement about those. And then we'll talk about other things like EI, resignation, etc. So the Prime Minister announced, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, that the Liberal government is going to mandate that those that work for the government or work for a crown corporation, as well as those that work in transportation, air, rail, marine transportation, will be required to get vaccinated, that we're going to have a vaccine mandate. As of now, that vaccine mandate has not been implemented. And potentially, depending on what happens with the upcoming election, we have an election in a week, there may never be a vaccine mandate. That mandate may never actually happen. So as of this moment, as I'm speaking, the federal government has not implemented that mandate. So as of this moment, it's still not legal. Again, talk about non-union employees, remember, not legal for the employer to mandate the vaccine. Now, for other federally regulated employees like banks, for example, if you work for TV or radio, that mandate wouldn't apply in any event. So bottom line is, even right now, today, federally regulated employees, there's no government requirement. So because of that, everything I said up until this point applies to you. It's likely illegal to let you go if you don't get the vaccine, but you can't stop it. It's a question of compensation, severance, damages that you may be owed after the fact. Now, before we talk about EI, again, those that have joined us, I'm Lior Samfiru, the employment lawyer. I'm the head of the employment law practice at Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. And if you do end up finding that you need my help to deal with this issue, to represent you in a wrongful dismissal case, if you lose your job, easy to do that, to connect with me and my team across Ontario, BC, and Alberta, employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. Now, I want to turn my attention to EI. A lot of people have asked me, well, if I lose my job, Lior, will I qualify for EI? The answer is yes, you will, but you're going to have to fight for it. We're going to have to fight for it, because it's likely that your employer is going to prepare a record of employment that says, we're letting you go for cause. EI is going to look at that and say, okay, they're letting you go for cause, you don't qualify for EI. So we're going to have to deal with that. In dealing with your employer and getting you compensation and severance, we're going to get them to issue a new record of employment that you can file for EI with it, and you'll get EI, but it won't be likely right away. Okay, so you have to understand and you have to consider that even though you will likely qualify for EI, it won't be upon termination. It won't be until we were able to resolve the case with your employer. Okay, so yes, you do qualify for EI. It may take some time, and ultimately we will have to fight for it. Okay, it's not going to be automatic. Same as with the severance that I mentioned. We will have to fight for that severance. We will get it. I have every confidence in the world that yes, we will. And I'll talk to you in about 60 seconds about how that severance is calculated, how much it is, but it's not something that your employer is just going to write you a check with your termination letter. We're going to have to fight for it. Now, one more thing before we talk specifically about severance is about resign. I've had a lot of employees contact me saying, well, my employer has implemented this policy. I'm just going to resign because I don't want that. I don't want to deal with that. No, no, no. Do not resign. Okay? If you're going to lose your job, it's much better to have been terminated, because if you're terminated, you're owed severance, you're owed potentially other damages. If you simply say, well, they've announced a policy, so I'm just leaving, and so I don't have to deal with it. If it's a resignation, it's going to be very difficult to get any compensation. So no, it's okay to tell your employer, if you decide not to get vaccinated, to tell your employer that, and if they choose to let you go, let them do that. Okay? They're going to give you your letter of termination, your record of employment, and that's when I come in and I'll help you get this resolved. But do not resign. Resignation is not a good idea. Okay, resignation is a way to lose potentially 2 years of pay and more. So no resignation unless there's no other choice, and there's always a choice. Okay, very important. Now, severance. You've heard me use that word quite a few times in this session. Talk about the fact that you're owed severance. So let's talk about what severance is. Now, severance is a generic term that is used by employment lawyer. Some people may call it termination pay, pay in lieu of notice, reasonable notice. Really what we're talking about is the amount of compensation that you're going to be owed if you lose your job. Now, your severance. A lot of people think, oh, I know what I'm getting. It's a week per year of service, or it's 2 weeks per year of service. No, it's not. Okay? Severance is calculated based on a number of factors. The main factors are your age, your position, and the length of your employment. So the longer you work, the older you are, and the more senior a position you have, the greater the entitlements. Okay? Now, that could be as little as a month and as much as 24 months, depending on those factors. But don't assume that you're owed little. In fact, short service employees, people that have worked for 5 years or less, actually get disproportionately more severance than longer service employees. So you may have only worked for their company for a year. If they let you go, you could be owed 3, 4, 5, even 6 months pay. And if you're very senior, you could be owed even more than that. You may have only worked for a company for a few months and be owed a few months severance. So don't assume, well, I've worked there for 6 months, what am I going to get? You could get several months pay, even if you work for a few months. Now, how do you find out right now if you want how much severance you're owed? Easy. Grab your smartphone, your tablet, desktop, whatever it is. Do this after, not right now because we're talking, and go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Again, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. I'll give it one more time, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. On that website, we have a tool called the severance calculator. It allows you to find out in seconds how much severance you're owed. It's free, it's anonymous, no strings attached, no credit cards to put in, no names to put in, nothing. It's just for you to find out, to get an estimate, if you will, of how much severance you're owed. You answer a few questions, 3 questions, your age, position, length of employment, and it's going to tell you whether you get a month, 24 months, or something in between. So pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. The reason you want to consider that is because that is one of the amounts of compensation you're going to be owed if you lose your job because you don't get vaccinated. So pocketemploymentlawyer.ca to get an assessment and an estimate of how much severance you're owed. Very important. Probably one of the most important things that you can do. And if you are offered severance by your employer, they say, well, you refuse to be vaccinated, we're going to offer you some severance. Please do me a favor. Do not sign it ever, 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 until either you call me or you go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Once you sign on that dotted line, you can't do anything about it. And in 90% of cases, 95% of cases, when an employee is let go, they're offered less, a lot less than what they're actually owed. Okay, so pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Now, I want to spend a minute to talk about independent contractors. I've had questions from people that are not necessarily employees, they're independent contractors, and still the company that they work for is saying, no more work for you unless you get the vaccine. So what rights do they have? Well, let's start with the idea of severance. Generally speaking, if someone is truly an independent contractor, they're not owed severance because they're not an employee, and independent contractors, if they're not employees, don't get severance. But a lot, maybe even most independent contractors are in fact misclassified. They call themselves independent contractors. The company they work for calls them an independent contractor, but the law may consider them to be employees. Misclassification, very, very common. So you may have the same right as an employee, even though you believe you're an independent contractor. So that means that if you are let go, you could be owed severance. Now, if you are a true independent contractor, you have a bunch of clients and you have your own tools and materials, you set your own hours, you haven't worked somewhere for many years. If you're truly an independent contractor and you lose your job because you don't get vaccinated, that could still be a human rights violation. It's not a severance situation, but it could still be a human rights violation. We would also want to take a look at the contract, if in fact you signed a written contract with your employer, because that may entitle you to some damages. So bottom line is, it may still be the same. Your rights may be the same if you believe you're an independent contractor. I mentioned pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Well, one of the things that you can do there is to find out if you are truly an independent contractor or an employee. We have a tool there that you answer a few questions, and anonymous and free, that allows you to find out if you're an employee or an independent contractor. So if that applies to you, definitely check it out. Now, I want to address something that I've been hearing a lot, and that is about Bill S-201, which is called the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. A lot of individuals have asked me, does this apply? Does this help? Not really. No, that act doesn't apply to COVID tests. It's really about no discrimination based on genetic information. It wouldn't apply to a COVID test. In any event, even if it did apply, it really wouldn't change the result, because there's already other laws that apply here. So having yet another law is not going to make a difference. So it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really apply. So there's not going to be any help from that piece of legislation. Okay, I know a lot of talk online about that. It's not going to apply here. So those are some comments, some thoughts, but remember, you do have rights, but those rights are often come down to what you can do after the fact. If your employer lets you go, if your employer suspends you, puts you on a layoff, etc. That's what you can do. Those rights you can't show some legislation to your employer and now they're prohibited from letting you go. You can't go to court preemptively to stop your employer from letting you go. You can only go to court if your employer does let you go. Now, I want to say something about employment law disputes. Unlike other disputes, employment law disputes usually resolve fairly quickly and easily. 99% of them don't go within 100 feet of a courtroom. They resolve, they settle, and they don't take years. The average lifespan of a case is 1 or 2 months, and the vast majority of cases resolve within 3 to 4 months, the vast majority. Okay, so don't be afraid about the legal process, but ultimately you have to decide whether you're willing to lose your job. I gave you some thoughts as to how you can increase the likelihood of keeping your job, but despite that, there's really not much you can do to physically stop. There's nothing, in fact, you can do to physically stop your employer from letting you go. So that's something I want you to keep in mind. Now, another question that I've been getting is, well, if I agree to COVID test, does my employer have to pay for the COVID test? So the answer is yes. Unless bottom line is this: if your employer says you can do COVID tests, but you'll have to pay for them, because it's a significant cost, especially if you're going to have to do a lot of them, that could also be a constructive dismissal. your employer essentially imposing a new cost, a new term of employment that they don't have a right to impose, and that could be a constructive dismissal. But again, if you say to your employer, I'm not going to pay for it, and your employer then says, fine, I'm going to let you go, you will lose your job, but you'll be owed some compensation after. But should the employer pay for the COVID test? Absolutely yes. Otherwise, it's a constructive dismissal. So let me see. I'm going to answer some questions here. And let's see. Hopefully, I've answered a lot of your questions. Let me see some questions. Okay. One question that came is, are unionized employees entitled to severance? The answer is no. If a unionized employee is let go improperly, then they have a right to be reinstated. But the union has to fight for that. Okay, you or I can't do that. The union has to do it. The only time a unionized employee gets severance is if there's no job and the employer followed the seniority lines, and even then it's going to be a lot less than the regular severance. So so that's something to keep in mind for unionized employees. Unfortunately, the rights are very different and much more limited, because you can't say, hey, I know the law, I'm going to pursue it. It has to be your union. A question that I've been getting is, what about unions and EI? So that's same thing happens here. So if you are let go by your employer, and if the union won't fight with your employer, then we would have to deal directly with EI and show EI why your employer did not have cause to let you go and why you should get EI. But either way, unionized or non-unionized, if you lose your job because you don't get vaccinated, you will ultimately have to fight, I say fight in quotation marks, to get EI. It won't be automatic. Okay. Now, there's some unions, for example, in Toronto, the TTC union has said, we're not going to accept these vaccine mandates, we're going to fight them. Fine. Other unions have said, no, we're not. So you can try to put pressure on your union, organize a group so that the union knows it's not just one or two people. There's a lot of individuals that have concerns about that, but ultimately it is up to your union. So you'd have to allow the union to try to fix it, and if not, you can only file a complaint against the union with the labor board. So let's see. So I have a question here that wanted me to discuss unionized environments more. Another question is, would the PCR test fall under medical surveillance program? No, it would not. But again, even if it did, it still doesn't change the analysis, right? Because you still cannot prevent your employer from doing something wrong. You can only deal with the consequences after. So another question, it's a good one, is what if the employer does not know our status since we chose not to disclose? Do you recommend that we disclose? No, I don't recommend that you disclose. The only time I think you should disclose is if your job is in jeopardy, and that's when you should. But if your employer doesn't know and is not putting any pressure, I don't see any reason to put your hands up and say, hey, guess what, employer, I'm vaccinated or I'm not vaccinated. But if there's a line drawn in the sand, if you don't tell me by Monday, employer, I'm letting you go, well, you have to decide at that point. If you tell your employer, okay. If you don't tell your employer, you lose your job. But again, severance, number one. And number two, potentially other damages, especially in Ontario, where it's not actually legal to fire someone if they don't disclose medical information. Okay, very important question. Let's see here, some more questions. Hopefully I've been able to answer a lot of what you guys are struggling with. Let's see. Do employers have the right to make the employee pay for COVID tests? We just answered that. Answered about Bill S 201. Okay. Okay, what if you submit, another question is, what if you submit your exemption and HR decides they are the experts and decide they want a second opinion, rather medical or religious? What about creed? So creed and religion, for the most part, are the same thing. In Ontario, we use creed instead of religion. Ultimately, it's a genuinely held belief that you have. Now, in terms of a medical condition, your employer does not have the right to say, oh, well, your doctor says you can't get the vaccine, I want a second opinion. No. If your doctor's note is not clear or it's kind of wishy-washy, maybe then. But if your doctor is clear, you can't get the vaccine for medical reasons, there's no basis for the employer to say, well, I want to see if another doctor agrees. If they have some questions, they need clarification, they can ask your doctor, or they can ask you to ask your doctor. But no, I would not agree to a second opinion. And an employer that does let you go because they don't agree with your doctor's exemption, or your doctor saying you can't get the test, that's an even more obvious form of a human rights violation. So it would, if I'm advising employers, I would say, no, you have to take a doctor's note seriously. You don't get to question it. You don't get to do anything. You have to abide by it. Another question I've had is, what if you're working remotely? Can your employer force you to be vaccinated or undergo testing? Again, the question shouldn't be, can your employer force you? The question should be, what do I do if they do force me? So it doesn't make any sense for your employer to require you to have a vaccine or COVID test, to mandate it if you're working remotely, because you're not interacting with someone. So because of that, what's the point? But remember, it's not legal, arguably, even if you are working in the office. So either way, it's illegal. But ultimately, if your employer says, even if you're working from home, if you don't get the vaccine or if you don't do COVID test, I'm going to let you go, I think that's silly if you're working remotely. But ultimately, you can't stop that, right? Because your employer will ultimately make that decision. You have to decide whether you want to lose your job or are willing to lose your job. So can they do that? No. Can you stop them from doing that? Again, unfortunately not. Another question that we've been getting is, what can someone do who is considering a new job and the employment agreement has a clause about requiring the new employee to be vaccinated or agree to undergo testing? So, or what happens if your employer says in an interview, hey, if you don't get tested, you don't have a job? Again, that is arguably illegal. That is arguably illegal. So, but what does that mean? That means if you don't get the job, you have to file a human rights complaint against that company. It doesn't mean that you'll get the job. You may get some damages. And unfortunately, in those situations, the damages for people that don't get a job are not that significant. We're not talking about a lot of money, but it isn't legal. No more that it will be legal for you to be asked, tell me if you're pregnant. Tell me if you have a medical condition. Again, that's not legal to do that in a job interview or in an employment agreement. But if that happens, and I know it does happen, you have the right and the option to pursue a human rights complaint. Same thing, by the way, if you're on a probation, you're in the probationary period. Ultimately, it could still be a human rights violation. Though human rights doesn't care if you're a new employee, old employee, probation or not, it will be a human rights violation in that situation. Let's see. Other questions here. I know I've got a lot that I'm pretty sure I've answered a lot of them. Again, is there a way to file an interim injunction against the hospital policy? No, you're not going to be able to file that for an interim injunction, unfortunately. Lior, my employer has set up its own vaccine passport through a third-party app to keep medical info private. Do I need to provide my vaccine status through this passport? Again, in Ontario, that's not legal. All right, in Ontario, we have a statute that says, Occupational Health and Safety Act says you cannot be told you must disclose your medical information. Other provinces, that's not illegal. So from a privacy standpoint, if they do that, they are complying with privacy legislation by protecting your information. That's a good thing, but you still don't have the obligation, certainly in Ontario, to provide that information. But we go back to the bigger problem. If your employer says, yeah, whatever, maybe we have the right, maybe we don't. We don't care. We're going to let you go if you don't. You will lose your job if you don't do it. But of course, you will be owed compensation. You'll be owed severance. And so, okay, there's questions here, great questions about termination clauses and the ability for employers to avoid severance. So let's be very clear about that. Some employers have employment agreements that you may have signed 2 years, 5 years, 10 years ago that have what I call a termination clause. Effectively, what it says, if we ever let you go, instead of paying you your full severance, which could be 24 months pay, we'll only pay you a small portion of it. Okay, so Is that a way for employers to avoid paying you severance? So I'll say a few things about that. Number one, the majority, not all, but the majority of these termination clauses are not enforceable for various reasons, majority of them. So if you have a termination clause in your employment contract, and if you want to know if it's enforceable or not, if it actually limits your entitlements, send it to me, okay? I'll read it and I'll tell you in 30 seconds flat if it's enforceable and if it's enforceable and if it limits you. So that's number one. Number two is if your employer lets you go and doesn't pay you anything, in other words, they breached their own termination clause, they can't rely on it. Our courts have said that an employer that breaches their own termination clause can't rely on it. They can't say, well, I didn't pay you anything, but if I did, it would only have to be this much because of your contract. So don't worry about it. In the vast majority of cases, termination clauses are not going to be useful. Now, a lot of people are asking me when you should contact me. You should contact me if you're either on the cusp of losing your job or have lost your job or have been suspended. Because I cannot, unfortunately, prevent your employer from letting you go or suspend you. I cannot do that. No one can, okay? What I can do and what I'm already doing is I'm helping employees get the compensation that the law says they should have if they lost their job, okay? So that's when you contact me. If you've lost your job, if you know you're losing your job because it's done, you've told your employer and there's no way back, let's talk about that. I can assess what you're owed. I can assess how to go about getting it and help you get it. So as much as I know you're struggling and no one wants to lose their job, let's be very clear. There's not a single person here. There's 700 people watching this and not one of you is eager to lose your job. I get that completely. But I cannot, unfortunately, and no one can stop your employer from doing that if that's what they're going to do. But you better believe that I can help you get severance, I can get you damages, get you what the law says you should have. Again, not up to me, I can get that to you. Now, that only applies to non-union employees, does not apply to unionized employees because I cannot help, no lawyer can help a unionized employee, it has to be the union. So push the union, threaten the union if you have to. You can file a complaint against the union with the labor board if they're not cooperating. So there's as a unionized employee, there's really no point contacting me. Love to hear from you, don't get me wrong, but I can't help you. It has to be the employer. Sorry, it has to be the union. But for non-union employees, you call me if you've been suspended. That's a constructive dismissal. You call me if you've had your hours reduced, your pay changed, if you've been put on a leave of absence. All of those are constructive dismissal. You call me if you lost your job, whether you've been offered severance or haven't been offered severance. That's when I get involved, okay? We have a whole team. We deal with that. I've already been dealing with that. But that's, for that question is call me in those situations. A question here, I'm in healthcare and I work remotely starting September the 20th. I'm required to self-administer a rapid antigen test every Monday and Thursday, even though I work remotely 100% of the time and have no symptoms. Those that don't comply face disciplinary action up to and including dismissal. Can I fight back without being dismissed? So you can't prevent your employer from dismissing if that's what they choose to do, even though it would not be right. And again, I'm assuming you're not part of a union. If you're part of a union, different situation, you have to talk to your union. But in this situation, I would make sure your employer understands that you don't pose any risk. Put that in writing, make sure that you're committing to doing the test if and when you do have to come in. If you come in, you will make sure you do the test, but you don't want to do the test while you're working remotely. There's no reason for that. Even the government mandate wouldn't apply in that situation. So that's what you can do. But ultimately, if the employer says, I heard you, I don't care, I'm going to let you go either way. Yeah, that's going to happen, unfortunately. I wish there was a magic button I can press to prevent that from happening. I cannot. But we'll have to deal with it with damages, severance, compensation, etc. Guys, I think that's all I'm going to have for today. Now, if you joined us part way, you can go back and watch this because there's a lot of information that I gave here. I'm pretty darn sure that I would have answered most of the questions that you have if it's related to employment. Yeah, I'm an employment lawyer. I'm not going to talk about things, with the province, the government, vaccine passports. I'm going to talk about your employer, your employment rights. So do that. And by the way, we'll probably do the session again. If you still want to talk to me privately, no problem, or my team, employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca is the website to connect with me, with my colleagues. I told you when you should do that, but you can do that at any time. On the other website, covidrights.ca, you'll find a lot more information about your rights during COVID, not just as relates to vaccines. So please check that out. Hopefully you found this session helpful, okay? I will be back. I'm not going anywhere. You can always contact me through employmentlawyer.ca. Please stay safe, take care of each other. Please treat each other well, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you very much. I'm Lior Samfiru, and I'm with employmentlawyer.ca, Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.